Do you want to know how you can have a huge competitive advantage over the competition by not ramming your pitch down people's throats, by not dragging them along through the sales process, by simply guiding them and adding value and pushing them in the right direction? Then this show is for you. Hello, Sales Nation. Welcome to today's episode of the Salesman Podcast. On today's show, we have David Fisher. He is the author of Hyper-Connected Selling, and we're talking about some of the concepts from the book today of what is a sales Sherpa and how can we become one? How can we guide our prospects rather than yank them through our own sales process? How can we implement a sales matrix rather than a linear step-by-step sales process and the benefits of that, and a whole lot more. You can find out more about David and his book over at hyperconnectedselling.com. And with all that said, let's jump in to today's show. David, welcome back again to the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm glad to have you on. We're going to dive into Hyper-Connected Selling, the book, some of the contents of that today. And I'm going to tee this up with a question that only you can answer at this moment in time, other than people who have read the book as well. But what the heck, and I was conscious of my language then, but what the heck is a sales Sherpa?
Well, a sales Sherpa, from my perspective, is really what the new salesperson has to become to be successful. I really think that to provide value in this ever-changing and rapidly evolving environment that we're in, salespeople have to learn to become guides for their prospects, for their customers. They have to be the person that can take their buyer through the buyer's journey, right? Because the buyer is already doing this. The research shows that they're doing a lot of their buying before they ever even engage with the salesperson. But when the salesperson actually gets involved, they have to be able to be the person to take the buyer up the mountain and help them achieve the goal that they want. So that's what a sales Sherpa is. Let
me ask you on this, and I don't know how consciously you were choosing words then, but is the goal to when you say take, to pull them up the mountain or to guide them up the mountain? And we can dive into the subtleties between the language there, and I don't want to kind of like dwell on the language you used. It's a separate question essentially, but are we pulling them through the buyer's journey towards our path, or are we guiding them with just general industry insights and allowing them to choose us, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think the answer is both. But when we look at pulling people through the buyer's journey, I think the distinction I would make in the past, the pulling was very aggressive. It was like, you have to come this way. You have to follow me. We wanted to put people into our sales process. I remember, even as a young salesperson, when somebody would give me an objection that I didn't know how to handle, I'd be like, I don't even know what to say here. Rather, I kind of imagine the sales Sherpa being just a few steps ahead of the prospect, giving them some relevant industry information, but also just some information about the path ahead. There's so much more information out there. We think that it makes buying easier, but the research actually shows that it makes buying harder for people. And so I think that the sales Sherpa has to be a few steps ahead, kind of testing out the water, so to speak, and maybe pointing out some pitfalls or some obstacles to the prospect and going, hey, maybe not go that way. Maybe let's go this way. So yeah, that's kind of how I see those two things integrate.
So this is somewhat unique to your thoughts on this, I think. But why, and obviously there's research that backs it up, but why does more information seemingly should make the buying process easier, should allow the buyer to do more of their own research and just make a decision? Why does it actually make it harder?
There's a couple things that happen. One is people actually don't necessarily know how to buy. An example, I actually use it in the book, is buying a home, right? If you're buying a home, there's maybe 5 or 6 times that you do that in your life. So just because you can get a lot of information, it doesn't mean you know what to actually do with it. You don't know what questions to ask, what's relevant information, what's not relevant information. And then I also think that what happens is we are bombarded with all of this information. We don't know what's noise and what's signal, what's worth paying attention to and what's not. And then you put on top of all that, there's neurological or neurobiological research, I think you would call it, that shows that the human brain, when it gets too much information, actually shuts down. Like we just stop thinking rationally and we just go, with kind of gut basic emotions instead of rational thought. Which is why if you've ever been to a store maybe and you're just tired and you're hungry and it's been a long day and you just go, I can't pick any of these. That's your brain actually shutting down from too much information. So
well, I think there's two real clear examples of that. One, going to restaurants when you've been and had a busy week. So if I go out for a meal, it'll be on like a Friday evening or maybe on a Saturday lunch. I'll take my girlfriend, and I have to physically make myself do this now, in that I'll be looking through the menu and I just choose the first thing that looks interesting or exciting to me. And then I put it down. I don't even look at the rest of it because I can feel this feedback loop of stress of you remember one thing, then you carry on going through, then there's another thing, then there's 3 decisions, and then as you go through, you find something else. And it's just not worth it. The meals aren't that different when you kind of rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 if you'd had them. So I always kind of conserve as much of my willpower as possible by choosing the first thing. And then the other analogy for this that I think everyone who's ever used Netflix will suffer from is you turn it on and most of it's crap. All the films are 10 years old and not the greatest films of all time. There'll be 2 or 3 like blockbusters on the front page that they kind of lure you into the service with, and the rest of it's just crap. So then you spend 25 minutes going through, scrolling, and if there's anyone else who's making a decision with you, even worse if you're watching it with your girlfriend, boyfriend, partner, or whoever. And so I think we both experienced them. But the house analogy was amazing. I've never thought about sales like this, so I appreciate this from you, David. So just to give context, my girlfriend she just bought a house, essentially. So she's never bought one before. I've never bought a house before. And her parents bought their last house 30 years ago. So they've been helping her buy and, going with her to the solicitors and things like that. I've been giving my insights from the business side of things of, the main insight that I could share over was everyone you're working with is trying to sell you something, and most people are on commission. So you have to take what everyone's saying with a grain of salt. Of if someone recommends and this happened, a 25-year mortgage versus a 30-year mortgage, and there was some maths involved in the decision between the two, you've got to be aware that they probably get more commission for selling the 30-year mortgage because there'd be more interest on it, and it's a bigger deal for them. And that was a revelation for her. So she's never been educated in the buying process of buying a house. And that analogy was amazing because I've never put 2 and 2 together. But yeah, if you're dealing with, the person you're dealing with could have just been promoted to that decision-making position. And so they've never bought your, Sam the Salesman's SaaS accounting software or the SaaS CRM or whatever it is. And so they have no idea what they're doing. So let me ask you this then, David, and this is going in a totally different direction than where I was planning to with the whole interview, but how do we uncover whether someone is an educated buyer, and not that they know the products on the market, but how do we uncover whether they know how to buy?
Wonderful question. I think the biggest thing to do is ask questions and listen. Now, that might sound really simple and really basic, but I think one of the things I really uncovered in writing the book is that what being a salesperson is fundamentally switching. I mean, when I started selling 20 years ago, I had people tell me, you should be in sales because you're good at talking, right? These days, you have to learn how to listen. I mentioned this idea of being a sales Sherpa and guiding the customer. What I think part of that is the customer has to decide that they want to go to the top of the mountain first, right, to extend the metaphor. And you're going to say, hey, I know how to get you there. I've been there before. I can help you. And when you do that, you go, okay, so tell me, why do you want to get to the top of the mountain? What are your thoughts? What's your experiences in mountain climbing? All right. I mean, we can definitely beat this metaphor into the ground here, but really that's what it comes from, approaching a new prospect with some openness. And I would almost use the word humility a little bit, instead of saying, I know what you need to know for a good decision-making process. Going, hey, have you bought this kind of product or service before? Have you, been in the market? The things that 5-10 years ago we were telling salespeople it was a good idea to do, now you have to do it. You have to ask those questions. You have to learn to be quiet for a long time and let the customer tell you what they need and then move forward.
I think a way, as you're saying this, a way that crops into my mind to describe it is perhaps the difference between a good coach and a bad coach. A good coach will shout at you and tell you what you're supposed to do and probably get you pretty far down the line. There's plenty of, I know for me, if I had someone here in the office just shouting at me every time I started to procrastinate, I'd probably get more done. But then a great coach would retrain even just your thought processes and your day-to-day actions so that you get more done organically, and they allow you to almost coach yourself by giving you feedback and advice. And just to empower the audience for a second here, and obviously there's this stereotype of sales that we're trying to change and turn on its head. But if you're dealing with a person who has never bought your product service before, and they know there's a problem and they need it solving, you could, and I've never really thought about like this either. You could be a huge relief for them. You could show up to their office or on the phone or over email or whatever it is. And if they've been really struggling to solve this problem, if you guide them through it, and we know that people buy from, there's data that shows that people buy from, it's cliche, but those that they know, like, and trust. If you're the one guiding them through it, you're going to spend more time with them than any of the competition, any of the other reps. And if you're the one that's being not passive, because you have to be not
incredibly
aggressive,
active. You have to be incredibly active, but you're right, not aggressive.
I'm struggling to think of the word. Not aggressive, but kind of to be whatever the word is. Proactive. It'll come to me in a minute, and I'll just blurt it out and shout it.
Well, here, let me give you a suggestion.
Assertive.
Engaged and assertive. Yeah.
Engaged and assertive. That's what I was looking for. Thank you. And so, if you're as you described, one or two steps ahead, you're being engaging with them, you're being assertive on, this is what I believe is the best path. So you're essentially a thought leader within the conversation, because they don't want to follow blindly someone that they don't have trust and confidence in. Then you're going to win the deal, because they're going to want to work with you because you're taking the pressure off them, and the pressure being relieved on them on the decision-making process is probably more pressure that's being relieved versus the internal pressure of getting the best, cheapest deal. So it almost takes price out of the conversation as well, right?
Absolutely. We often talk in sales about relieving people's pain points, right? Well, think about the word pain, right? There's a discomfort, there's a challenge. If they do know, whether or not they know how to make a good decision here, this is a stressful part of their life. So if you're walking in there as the salesperson, but also the guide, the Sherpa, the person who's going to help them do this, we all want help, right? And yeah, you nailed it on the head with the idea of know, like, and trust. It's right, one of the oldest sales cliches, but it's still true. I mean, it's one of the reasons I think I wrote the book was because there's all of this talk about technology, and I love technology. I think, all the tools we have available are awesome, but they're still just tools that we can use to establish that relationship, right? The know, like, and trust. Because if I can get you to trust me, yeah, there's the times that I'm going to just kind of let you guide the process as the buyer. But then, like a good coach sometimes does not maybe yell, but go, hey, you're about to make this decision. It's a bad one because of X, Y, and Z. Let me tell you what this other customer I worked with who was faced with the same situation. They're in the same industry. Here's a different way of approaching it. This was maybe a little more thinking outside the box. How about that? Right? And they go, oh, wow, I would have never thought about that. You've just provided some value to that person. So that's kind of where I see it going in the future.
Definitely. And being able to add value on that front and reduce different pain points. You could even look at your product, the pain points it relieves, then factor on top of that the pain points of the individual who's buying it. And an example that comes to my head with this is, if I buy anything, I will always search Amazon first. And this is so stupid. And I spend more on Amazon when it's cheaper on another website, because I just click one button and it's bought and it's delivered the next day because I've got Amazon Prime, so it's free delivery. Versus the pain, which is, irrelevant really, considering we're all online, I've got a roof over my head. There's so many, the pain is so minimal of in reality, but it feels like more than what it is. But the pain of in reality of searching Google, finding a reputable website, comparing the prices. I'd rather just pay another 15 quid for the pair of trainers or whatever it is and get them through Amazon. So we can almost look at sales like this of if you can guide someone and relieve the stress and pressure of doing the deal essentially and make it unconfrontational for them, but being assertive as a thought leader within that, there's value in that. I love this. This is blowing my mind.
Huge value. I think something that you really touched on there was this idea of being a thought leader. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we saw in the last few years when people were talking about social selling, there's this idea that, salespeople were going to become thought leaders and they were going to write content and become like this really famous person in their industry. Being an influencer is hard. As you and I know, creating good content is hard. The average salesperson should not spend their time doing that, but they should spend time becoming a thought leader in a very small pool, right? A thought leader among their prospects, their customers, their immediate network, so that when somebody does have a question, I actually recently refinanced my home here, and I have a guy who's a mortgage broker. I've known him for 10 years. To the same thing, I know this is how he makes money, and that's fine. But I was just like, I don't want to spend the next month researching. I trust him. I know he's going to take care of me. I'm like, just tell me what to do. He gave me some options. I said, boom, that one, refinancing done, right? So even just finding people that we can trust.
Let me ask you this, because what you just described seemingly is what, not successful, that's the wrong word, but people higher up the food chain are more likely to do. Am I correct in thinking that of you just want the problem solved, you want 3 solutions, you want to choose one of them, and then you're done with it? Is that as you go up the sales food chain, as you go to the CEO, and maybe they delegate that job to someone else, and then it gets passed back to them, but that versus the end user who is more bothered about what the colleagues are going to think of them if they make a bad decision and all these kind of things, is what you just described then of bam, bam, 3 choices, I trust this person. Is that more likely to happen as we go up the food chain?
I think as you go up the food chain, there's less attention, right? One of the biggest challenges we all have is a lack of attention. We've got so much competing for our time. I do think that what happens as you go up the food chain, because there's less attention, people want to be able to say, hey, give me 3 options. Tell me why the difference is and what the pros and cons. I'm going to choose one. I think what you're seeing definitely on the B2B side is that the decision maker, the internal champion, the end user, the person who's paying for it, those might be 4 different people, right? And they're all engaged in the sales process. So I think what happens is, let's look at this very practically from a salesperson's point of view. Your job is to become a thought leader, or at least a micro influencer for all of those people, right? And you want to make sure that you've got that trust built up. I think why you do see more of these quick decisions as you go up the food chain, not only because people have less attention, but because they've been in business longer, right? I mean, I mentioned my mortgage guy. I've known him for 10 years, right? We've built that relationship over time. Somebody who's in a C-suite position, they've been in business for a while.
Well, they probably, going back to what we were saying before, they probably know how to buy, and that's the difference between them and the stuttering, struggling person in middle management.
They know how to buy, and they usually have some more confidence in their judgment, right? They've probably made a lot of good decisions, made some bad ones, and learned from those. And I think that's a huge part of it as well. And so to kind of go back to something you said earlier, you never know if people know how to buy, where their confidence is. If they're the person who's going to make the decision, but they know if they make the wrong one, it might cost the company a lot of money, and that might prevent them from getting promoted. So building the relationship becomes so much more important. And that's why, we mentioned this before, the difference between assertive and aggressive. Being a sales Sherpa takes as much, if not more work than ever before, right? Even though they're just not knocking on the door, making cold call after cold call, they're still investing a lot of time and energy. It's just much more of a long-term play, right? And I think we spoke about this actually when we were talking about networking last time. You've got to hit your quota this month. You've got to put that work in, absolutely. But how are you planting seeds that are going to come to fruition down the line. Because eventually we're just going to be in a long-term sales world, because anything that's short-term is going to go to Amazon, right? It's going to go
Yep.
online. So we have to find ways to provide value as a salesperson. I really think it comes down to those relationships.
I think it goes further than just even Amazon. It's going to go down to Amazon Alexa. They're not just selling these devices to, give you. They're not just trying to give you value up front by telling you what the weather is. They're trying to pull a load of data so that when they know that you go to work at the same time every day and you ask for the weather on that day, and then it's not just going to tell you the weather. It's going to try and sell you the umbrella that you need to get to your car or whatever it is. And then a drone's going to drop it off before you go outside. And that's going to get more and more sophisticated over time of you need to refinance your mortgage. And so you'll go, Alexa, tell me the interest rates, and the free solicitors around. It will be the next essentially contextual Google advert of when you search Google, those top results that are paid ads. It'll be that. It'll be kind of whoever's paying, not necessarily the best service, but in the marketing world, whoever's paying the most, whoever is gambling on the return on their investment of being at the top of the Alexa list, that's who you're going to be speaking to. And so all the, obviously refinancing and mortgages and stuff is more complicated than what I just made it out to be. But that might be how you get started. That might be how you get into these individuals. And the complex B2B sale, hopefully it gets continually more and more complex, so that as that eats one end of B2B sales, there's more decision makers involved, there's more risk involved, there's bigger deals, so that we're always safe on the other side. But that is definitely going to eat into a percentage of the people who are listening, their roles. But I want to come back to process for a second here, because essentially what we're talking about is not putting the prospects through a process, our process. We're guiding them through their own process, or we're helping them put a buying process, a buying journey in place. So does that screw up what we typically have in a sales funnel of prospecting, discovery, more questions, qualification, and things like this? Does that process become less linear and more malleable, or should we still be trying to? I was going to say, are we still trying to funnel them, crush them down this process that is predefined by us? Okay, so if it does become more malleable, how do we deal with that? And how do we track it? And how do we, not necessarily from the CRM perspective, but how do we know personally where our customers are within it?
I do think that we have to really reconfigure or reimagine how the sales process works. I just don't think that the world of sales is linear. You mentioned the word linear. I think that's a great way of looking at it, because we used to think, I learned this when I started selling, there was 7 steps to the sale. You did 1, then 2, that was it, right? And maybe somebody was fancy had 11, somebody was really basic had 4. In the book, I talk about the fact that sales now takes place in a matrix, in a 3D web. We talked about the number of decision makers involved. Well, imagine if there's 5 decision makers, let's say, which is kind of a pretty average, somewhere 5 to 7 is the average. Let's say there's 5, and they each have 3 people they talk to, and they each go to 2 different blogs. You can see how quickly this spins out of control, right? So I think the first step is to embrace that complexity, to not try to just mash every sales conversation into your linear process. I think this is going to drive sales managers nuts, but that's the world we live in, right? Yeah. Pretending it's simpler than it is not going to help. And I think what will happen is, if you want to look at this process-wise from a practitioner point of view, I think it's important to be able to identify the main beats. A word that often gets thrown around is cadence, right? When you're out prospecting and talking to people. So really look at what are the main beats, that a person has to go through to be a prospect, to be a customer. The first one might be, do they trust me? Have I provided some insights that will help them, make some better decisions, even though they're not really engaged with me specifically? Has this person then maybe gone dark where they don't need to buy from me right now, but maybe in 6 months they will. So I should make sure I'm continuing to feed them some information, staying top of mind with them. Have I gone in and had specific meetings with specific solutions yet? So there still will be these, again, main beats that you hit, during the sales process. But you just have to accept that it's not A to B to C to D. It's beat one, there's a whole bunch happening here, and then beat two, and then there's a whole bunch happening here, then beat three. Oh wait, a new decision maker came in. Let's go back to step two. Make sure that they're tied into me. Then we'll go to step three. Yeah, so it's just understanding that it is a little more complex and being okay with that. And again, that's where I think salespeople are going to find value, and they're going to find jobs, because if it is linear, guess what computers are really good at? Linear, right? So anything that kind of jumps the tracks, so to speak, that's where we're going to really find a way to keep giving value and be a way to keep being employed.
Love it. Okay, I want to come back and wrap up with the content out there, because I think you think about this positively, in that there's more content out there. There is more opportunity through content to build trust, and that might be your marketing team as opposed to you as the individual salesperson. But I believe that it also takes away, if you're an ethical salesperson, if you're doing everything right, and if you're playing the long term, it takes out some of the short-term aggressive salespeople who are full of manipulation and bullshit, because it makes it more difficult to manipulate and bullshit the customer. So I see this shift in the world of sales as a almost an advantage for those who are entwined in it and into it. Do you agree with that? Is the shift that we've seen recently in sales of the buying process happening later, the salesperson jumping into the buying process later in the cycle, the fact that we're not gateholders of any information anymore, it's all online, product specifications and things like that. Is that a competitive advantage for salespeople who are doing the right thing?
I think it's completely a competitive advantage, although I do think that we are in the midst of this evolution, right? So it's kind of painful, right? Anytime you have evolution, it hurts. I think, though, you're exactly right. An example I use in the book is Barney from How I Met Your Mother, who, the womanizer who was, just not a nice person to women. Like, in today's world, that wouldn't work, because there's Facebook and there's Twitter, and your reputation precedes you. And so being aggressive, being, only focused on the short term, doing whatever you can to get the sale, it just doesn't work. And so and it's going to work less and less moving forward. So I think that it's absolutely a competitive advantage to be in it for the long term, to meet somebody who might be a great prospect and say, hey, you might have a need now, and if so, let's talk. But if not, let me just keep giving you insights. Let me help educate you about, what we do, about the industry, help you be successful at your job, so that when you are ready, whether that's next week, in 6 months, in a year and a half, I'm the person you're going to call. So I think it's going to really, kind of stretch out the spectrum of salespeople, and the ones that are just aggressive and that are just, let's face it, jerks who only care about themselves. It's going to be a tough world to live in.
I've certainly talked about this on the show before, but I've, out of the kind of recording button being pressed, I've talked about it with a bunch of people. And I think that this is going to happen at some point, but I don't think we're ready for it to roll out now. But the same way Yelp has reviews, and people may or may not know this, companies can essentially pay to have bad reviews removed, and that's their main revenue model. I think LinkedIn is probably going to do the same. So you can leave essentially almost only positive reviews, and I think the person who you're leaving on has to approve it for it to appear. But imagine if they turned that on its head and allowed public reviews of people's products or services on LinkedIn, as in, this salesperson professionally was fantastic, or this salesperson screwed me over and I lost my job because of it. They might still charge to remove the negative ones, and so it's lesser effective at pushing public opinion one way or the other. But you could probably charge $1,000 to remove a terrible review like that, because that would stop you getting your next sales job. It would stop any, maybe not stop, but it would lead to awkward conversations with procurement officers who've Googled you just before they're going to tie into you with a contract or something that's more longer term. I honestly think that's going to come in this, as you define it, this hyper-connected world. I think things like that are just beyond the horizon, that right now we think, no, they couldn't possibly ever do that. And the flip side of that is as well that you go, well, I'm going to take my profile down. But they'll probably be worded in the terms and conditions that you don't own your profile anyway. You can you can delete perhaps your picture or something from it, but perhaps your name and then just the reviews will remain when you leave the service. So that would change sales in an instant.
Well, I mean, you're always seeing that with companies with like Glassdoor, for example. But I do think that's going to happen. I would say that the one thing that salespeople can do right now, take advantage of that, is it's not that you can remove bad reviews, but the idea of using, in this case, social media. So LinkedIn, you mentioned, using it proactively to put out great content about yourself. The idea of personal branding, I think, is really important because, we can do everything possible so that, hey, the first you Google my name and my company, the top 10 hits are all saying nice things about me and positive things. That's why I go back to the idea. It's not about being a thought leader, but kind of like a micro influencer in that small space that you're trying to influence. That's what I think we're seeing salespeople who really get this. It's a huge competitive advantage.
Love it. And I'll just wrap up with this of, myself or Sam the salesman again in medical devices. There was only 30, 40 surgeons that needed to know who I was and trust me for me to crush it from now till the next 15 years, as long as the product kept updated and moved, because it was a tech product essentially that I was selling. For me or Sam the salesman to have great success in a market like that, perhaps 30, let's drill it down, it could be 30 surgeons, 30 urologists, it could be locally 6 theatre managers, and then drill it down even further, or it could be like 3 or 4 procurement officers or procurement managers, and maybe 1 or 2 financial directors over 1 or 2 trusts. They could set up, if my target was $1 million, £2 million a year, they could easily facilitate 1 or 2 deals like that size, or a theatre refurb or something along those lines every year. And at that point, selling becomes a really nice job to have. It was me going to Bradford, the local hospital, who'd super bought into the last company that I worked for. And rightly so, it was a great company and great products. But I used to go there every Friday and essentially just DOS for 3 or 4 hours on a Friday afternoon. It was my Friday afternoon account to just go in. I'm still working, but I'm just chatting with the surgeons and hanging out with them and hanging out with the nursing staff as well. And every year they continue to buy. And I think even the way I described it then, I described it as a DOS, as a layabout on a Friday, because it was it's quite close to home as well. So 5 o'clock, I'm out that door and I'm back home at kind of like 20 past 5. But in hindsight, having just said all that, it was probably the right thing to do. And that's why there was such a big account, because I was continuously doing that. So it was, there's loads of times in sales where I've done things that at the time I thought was, not necessarily lazy, but it turned out to be the right thing. And I think that is an example of one of them. And with that, David, I've got one question, mate. I've asked you before, and I'm going to ask you it again. And that is, I wrap up the show with this every single time. That is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
I would tell him to be a lot less afraid of the perceived good or bad results that might happen from his actions, which is a fancy way of saying just relax and go for it. It took me 20 years to get to that point where I'm a lot less concerned with, oh my goodness, what happens if this doesn't work? I wish I had known that at 23. I would have asked for more sales. I would have taken more risks. I would have asked more girls out on dates. A lot of good things would have happened. So that's just ask. You never know what's going to happen. That's positive, and it's not going to kill you. So that's what I would tell myself.
Is that because I love this, and I drill myself like weekly to have the same kind of philosophy, but is that because you set it up so you don't care about the answer, as in you're not bothered, fine, whatever, I can't control it, and so it can just happen? Or is it that you give yourself so many options that whatever happens, it'll be all right? If that makes sense. There's a sort of difference between you're conservative in what you're doing, and because you've got so many horses in the race, to coin a phrase, that you're almost guaranteed success? Or is it because you're just completely outcome independent and it just, it's almost like a Buddhist effect of it just doesn't matter?
Both. I mean, I actually, because I am actually a practicing Zen Buddhist, so that non-attachment to results is very powerful. But the Western salesperson in me goes, hey, if I try 20 or 30 times, one of them will work.
Yeah.
And it's just taking the pressure off. I've actually found when you make a lot of attempts, that takes the pressure off. which actually makes those attempts more successful, right? And it's this really weird dynamic that's really powerful and really fun. But the less you're attached to the outcome, the more likely you are to get the good outcome, which is kind of that, very much like, the force, you can't push it too hard. You just trust the force and you'll get the good results.
Well, thank you for wrapping this up with the most nerdy comment of the day. I appreciate that. From one huge Star Wars fan to seemingly another. With that, David, tell us a little bit about the book, where we can find it, and essentially we've covered we've scratched the surface of some of the topics. So give us a bit of an overview of it as well.
So, hyper-connected selling, winning more business by leveraging digital influence and creating human connection. There's this little website called Amazon. Easy way to get it. You can get the print version, the Kindle version, and there's an audiobook version as well. We can listen to my voice for hours and talks all about what we were discussing today, but really goes into also a lot of more tactical approaches to how do you become a sales Sherpa, how do you actually work within the sales matrix. And if you have any questions for me, find me on Twitter, dfishrockstar, or at my home base, www.davidjpfisher.com.
Good stuff. Well, I'll link to that, as always, on the show notes of this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. With that, David, I want to thank you for your insights. I want to thank you for turning some of this on. You've turned some of it on its side, and I feel like your philosophies, your techniques are the next 2-3 years ahead of where we are, what we need to be doing now to have any success whatsoever. I feel like what you're describing, what we're talking about in this episode, is how you do it now and have success, but then that compounds over the next 2, 3, 5 years. So I really appreciate that, and you kind of opening the eyes of the audience, hopefully, as to where sales is moving. And so with that, I want to thank you, as always, for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.